Chapter 6 Primitive Levels of Evil. Without trying to prove it again, I take as my starting point the fact that fairy tales mirror collective unconscious material, which leads us, before we enter into details, to a further general question. If it is collective unconscious material, are there ethical problems in fairy tales? If there are, that would mean that the unconscious has an ethical, moralistic feature or trend, which is something we cannot assume out of hand. Before we get into this, it is better to turn first to personal and collective unconscious material as it can be observed in individual people, for there one finds all the information. And for this, I can refer you to Jung's article, The Conscience, in which he discusses his standpoint. He raises the same question which I have now put to you, and answers it in the following way. Certainly, human society as a whole shows a basically ethical tendency. Except for a few abnormal cases, it can be assumed that everywhere, in every nation, the human psyche includes in its structure a certain proneness to what Jung calls man's ethical reaction towards his own acts. Man is not indifferent to what he does, but everywhere tends to have an evaluating judgment toward his own activities and motives. Such judgment may differ from one nation to another, but the fact that one has such a feeling reaction is a generally human feature. Closer analysis, however, shows a separation between unconscious motivations and a conscious superstructure of reflections, conscious thoughts about one's own motives, and subjective evaluating judgments. Thus conscience, when we analyze it in detail in human beings, is a very complex phenomenon which has led to the worldwide question known to theologians as the problem of the wrong, bad conscience, and the wrong, good conscience, with all the falsifications of conscience and pseudo-guilt feelings. Other observers contend that all these complications are not guilt problems, for this complex situation of an unconscious and a conscious part already existed in the basic structure of the whole mankind. Jung then discusses at length the problem of the Freudian concept of the superego, the Freudian explanation of the reactions of feelings of guilt, bad conscience, and ethical tendencies in man. And he finds that the superego coincides with what he calls the collective moral code, which, in our society, is combined with our Judeo-Christian patriarchal religious tradition. In individual cases, this code can function partly unconsciously and can lead to all sorts of feelings of guilt and complications, inhibitions, or motivations to act, summed up by the Freudians as the phenomenon of the superego. In this sense, we Jungians do not deny the phenomenon, for it exists and is the collective moral code which can either be recognized consciously by an individual or can exert an unconscious or semi-unconscious pressure on his motivations. But on closer examination, the superego is seen to be a historical formation and, therefore, not responsible for the whole ethical problem of mankind, but only a part of it. In other words, what Jung calls the ethical reaction of the human psyche is not identical with the Freudian superego. On the contrary, the two concepts can even clash and be opposed. Jung expresses his view that we are under the pressure of two factors, that of the collective ethical code, which differs from nation to nation and generally dictates our ethical behavior, and that of a personal moral urge, which is individual and often does not coincide with the collective code. Naturally, wherever they coincide, they are difficult to differentiate. Let us assume, for instance, that you are furious with someone whom you feel like killing, but you realize that normally and personally that is not something you could or would do. It is that general collective code speaking within you. Or is it your own personal, more ethical side, your feeling relatedness, which stops you? In such a case, one cannot make a distinction. Personally, one could say that even if there were no observer, no police, or moral code, one would not do such a thing. But that would be hard to prove. but that would be hard to prove. There we go. The fact is that you can't do it because something within you prohibits it, and that is all there is to it. That these factors, the personal urge toward an ethical reaction and the moral code, are not identical, becomes obvious when there is a so-called collision of duties. Jung says that it is not really difficult to know what one has to do as long as there is no collision of duty. The difficulty arises in a situation where whatever you do is half right and half wrong, where whatever you do has a partly wrong aspect. A typical problem is that which confronts a doctor who has to tell or not tell a patient that he has a carcinoma. If he doesn't tell the truth, he lies, but if he gives the patient a moral shock, he may do him a great harm. So, what does he do? The moral code does not answer such a question. Some of his colleagues may say that one must never tell, while others will say that one must tell the truth, that even such a shock is better in the long run. But there is no general ethical rule, and that is a conflict of duties. The duty to tell the truth and the duty to spare the patient. With endless such examples and much more complicated ones, we suddenly realize that the ethical code is not the only rule for our behavior. In certain cases, even if there is a clear answer as to what you should do, you may yet have a strong feeling that to do it would be immoral for you. Then you are in the soup, and then you realize that really there are two things which dictate human behavior: the collective ethical code, which we can also call the Freudian superego, and the personal moral individual reaction. The latter is generally referred to as the voice of a god or God. The Romans would call it the genius. Socrates would say, my daemon. And the Naskapi Indians of the Labrador Peninsula would call it Mestapieo, the great man who lives in everybody's heart. In other words, it is a figure which we call an archetype of the self, the divine center of the psyche, which naturally, in different cultures, has different names and connotations. If this phenomenon arises within oneself, one generally has a strange feeling of certainty as to what is the right thing to do, no matter what the collective code may say about it. And generally, the voice not only tells one what to do, but imparts a conviction which even can enable an individual to die for it, as did Socrates and many Christian martyrs. If this inner voice dictates something exceedingly noble, something which is on the line of the collective ethical code, then nobody will get upset, but will think it wonderful, right, heroic, and whatnot. But unfortunately, in practical life, as we see every day in analytical work, this voice of God, or inner instinct of truth, can sometimes dictate something absolutely shocking. This occurs even in the Bible. Imagine Hosea being told by God that he should marry a prostitute. I am sure that if he had gone to any clergyman, whether Protestant, Anglican, Catholic, or Jewish, they would have all said, "My dear man, this is a psychological delusion. God cannot tell you to do such a thing." For theologians tend to think that they know what God can and cannot do, and therefore one must be wrong, and it is the devil or one's own shadow or one's own repressed sexual problem. Nowadays, they would say it was his own repressed sex anima problem which spoke within Hosea, but it was not God. How they would know this, God knows, but they would seem to know it. They have perhaps dined with God and discussed it over black coffee, and therefore know for sure. But someone not willing to submit to such knowledge, which is the traditional moral code, gets in terrible difficulties, for naturally, if he is honest, he will not know. He may say, yes, perhaps it is my foul anima which makes me feel I have to marry a prostitute. Who can prove that this is the voice of God? And then the problem becomes difficult. One could say that there is no answer to it, except Jung has observed that if one stews long enough in the agonies of such a conflict, then somehow an inner line and inner development becomes clear, which gives the individual enough certainty to continue on his way, even at the risk of committing an error. Naturally, one is never sure, but from the Jungian standpoint, it is better always to remain in an attitude of doubt towards one's own behavior, which means to do the best one can, but always to be ready to assume that one has made a mistake. You can interpret your dream one way and make a big mistake. Then, looking at it again, you can think that it might have been interpreted differently, and there you are. This we must risk. There is no remedy, but according to the Jungian standpoint, there is a grown-up attitude which has given up clinging to the infantile kindergarten rules. All these are higher and more differentiated problems, which naturally are not visible in the collective unconscious material of fairy tales. In this material, there are only references to what Jung mentions first in his article, that is, a basic ethical reaction inborn in the human psyche, which is strangely impersonal and very different from what one would call a conscious ethical reaction. The following example will give you a feeling of the atmosphere of this phenomenon. An international criminal who had already murdered 10 or 12 people, a kind of pathological creature who committed a cold-blooded murder without the slightest reaction of conscience, killed an unknown old man in the street in Zurich, took his money, and got caught. Adolf Guggenbuhl Craig had to give the court the psychiatric expert's opinion and ascertain whether or not the man was responsible for his deeds. Dr. Guggenbuhl had the intelligent idea of investigating the dreams of this man, and he told Dr. Franz Ricklin and me a dream without telling us the whole story. He simply asked what we thought of a man of 40 who had such a dream. Naturally, I did not know that the dreamer was a pathological murderer, but I said literally, quote, "Hands off, leave that man alone. He is a lost soul." Close quote. The dream in question was very simple. It was one which was repeated frequently, in which the murderer went to an amusement park where there were big swings. He was on such a swing, swinging up and down, higher and higher, when suddenly the swing went too high and he fell into empty space. That was the end of the dream. I thought, my God, swinging between the opposites and taking it as a pleasure with no reaction toward it, taking it as fun. And the lysis in the end sentence of the dream was falling into empty space, without even the reaction of, I woke up with a cry. There was no emotional reaction. I could only say that if this was a lost soul, I felt, to put it in pictorial language, as if God had written off this soul. In the dream, there is no attempt by nature to save the man by giving him a shock. We assume that dreams come from the unconscious instinct, that is, nature. His unconscious tells him, just as cold-bloodedly as he murders, that he is lost. He speaks with his own cold-bloodedness, talking to him on his own level. I tell this story as an example of a moral reaction of the unconscious. It is not like an aunt who says, you shouldn't do this or that. It is not an ethical superego which gives rules of behavior. It is a nature reaction, cruelly objective in an uncanny way, but one cannot help feel that it is an ethical reaction, for the unconscious somehow reacted toward the immense inhumanity of this murderer. So the so-called ethical reasons of the unconscious psyche are sometimes very objective and different from our conscious ethical standards. However, Jung in his paper also tells of another example which might lead one to conclude that the unconscious can be moralistic, even in the old aunt and schoolteacher manner. He mentions a businessman who had an offer to join in a crooked business affair. The man had not consciously realized how shady it was, but wanted to sign a document by which he would join the business. At night he dreamt that his hand, when he was about to sign the paper, became black with dirt. He told this dream in analysis, and Young warned him not to become involved. It transpired that it was a very crooked business in which he would have been caught. In this specific case, it can be said that the unconscious coincided with the collective moral code, gave him a clear ethical warning in the conventional sense of the word. For it is said, you will make your hands dirty if you go into this business. So the unconscious shows that it has many ways of reacting. Sometimes it reacts as though there was an ethical reaction, but sometimes it is also just a cruel nature, as in the case of the murderer. Nevertheless, with the feeling function, one can realize that basically there is something like a moral reaction, though it can be difficult to be grasped in detail. Thus, one can say that an ethical reaction, even if it comes from layers of the collective unconscious of the human psyche, seems to be something highly individual and highly specific. One could even say that each individual has his own ethical level and form of reaction. There are, for instance, thick-skinned people who can afford a lot of what we would call sins. They can walk happily on other people's corns without the slightest repercussion. Other people cannot afford anything. As soon as they sidestep a bit from their own inner law, they get the most awful dreams and inner reactions. So along with all the other problems. There is that of ethically and the non-ethical gifted people. Naturally, ethically sensitive individuals have trouble in finding their own individual inner way, but one can also say that to be ethically sensitive is one of the great incentives in the process of individuation. Whenever I see that somebody in analysis has this sensitivity, I know that it is all right, for a lot of problems are already solved. The thick skins sometimes give one a lot of trouble because they can repress more easily. People in analysis sometimes do the most incredible things, and you think that now it will be possible to catch them on their shadow. But naturally, as an analyst, one has to wait until they themselves have a dream. Then they have no dream. The unconscious has pardoned them. And then you just put your own moral indignation in your pocket and say nothing, because that would be a waste of breath. Here, however, our main concern is not with all these superstructures of ethical problems. I only mention them to clarify the collective material I am now going to talk about is on a much more simple basis than all the complications which belong to the problem of individuality. I have looked at collective fairy tale material for many years, wondering whether it would be possible to find a few general rules of human behavior which could always be valid. I was fascinated by the idea of finding some generally human code, simple but beyond national and individual differentiations, some kind of basic rules of human behavior. I have to confess that I have not found a standard basic rule, or rather, I have found it and I have not found it, for there is always a contradiction. I can tell you stories which say that if you meet evil, you must fight it, but there are just as many which say that you must run away and not try to fight it. Some say to suffer without hitting back. Others say, don't be a fool, hit back. There are stories which say that if you are confronted with evil, the only thing to do is to lie your way out of it. Others say no, be honest, even toward the devil, and don't become involved with lying. For all these I could give you examples, but it is always a yes and a no. There are just as many stories which say the one as the other. It is a complete complexio oppositorum, which simply means that, post eventum, I disappointedly came to the conclusion that really it should be like that, because it is collective material. However, otherwise, could there be individual action? For if collective material is completely contradictory, if our basic ethical disposition is completely contradictory, only then is it possible for us to have an individual, responsible, free conscious superstructure over those basic opposites. then we can say that in human nature it would be right to do this or that. But I am going to do this, the terium, the third thing, which is my individuality. There would be no individuality if the basic material were not contradictory. That was my comfort after having discovered the terrible truth of the contradictory structure. The one exception to the rule of contradiction, however, seems to be that one must never hurt the helpful animal in fairy tales. I found a few cases where disobedience leads to trouble, but in the long run does not lead to disaster. You may temporarily disobey the advice of the helpful fox or wolf or cat, but if you basically go against it, you do not listen to the helpful animal or bird or whatever it is. If any animal gives you advice and you don't follow it, then you are finished. In the hundreds and hundreds of stories, that is the one rule which seems to have no exception. However, whenever we analyze what the animals say, again it is completely contradictory. One says to run away, another says to fight, another to lie, another always to tell the truth. The animal plays it is this way and that. For an ethical standpoint, if you go against it, you are lost. This would mean that obedience to one's more basic inner being, one's instinctual inner being, is the one thing which is more essential than anything else. In all nations, in all fairy tale material, I have never found a different statement. There is another factor which I want to mention briefly, which we can see when we look at the ethical problems posed by fairy tales, and that is the function of compensation. Jung has observed this as being one of the typical features of the functioning of the unconscious in individuals in general. In his paper on the conscience, Jung mentions a lady who thought of herself as a pure saint, and who every night dreamt the dirtiest sexual obscenities. That is a coarse example of what we call the law of compensation. We know also that sometimes people who live their darkest side and repress their better ego have all sorts of dreams of Christ, redeemers of mankind, and so on. Hedwig Boye has written a book entitled Menschen mit groß Schatten, people with a big shadow. The author is an analyst who specializes in working with prisoners and is principally interested in big fish. The more people a prisoner has killed, the more interesting he is to her. She's analyzed several such people, and it is striking how many of these black sheep have an amazingly white shadow. At the end of the book, she quotes the sentimental, idealistic, and touching letters which such big fellows write to their mothers at Christmas. There you can see that they have an infantile, goody-good boy shadow, which is typically compensatory to the fact that they are reckless murderers in their conscious lives. Sometimes she can make good use of this fact, and would succeed, with tears and much drama, in converting the murderers to their positive shadow. Then they could be let out of prison, and then behaved. These generally compensatory tendencies in the unconscious are mirrored in fairy tales. There is a Japanese fairy tale where the positive solution is that a man has to beat up an official and then can find hidden treasures. This, I would say, is typically compensatory for the ethical setup of that country, where it is specifically unthinkable that anyone could beat a government official over the head with a stick. But the fairy tale says that is what must be done, and then you will find treasure under your kitchen floor, so to speak. Such a fairy tale would not have much value for Swiss Democrats, for we do not need to be told that it is good to beat officials over the head from time to time, so that they do not get too big and too inflated. But in other countries, where their social hierarchy is severe, such a fairy tale contains the shocking truth which has to be recalled to consciousness. Such compensatory tendencies are to be found in fairy tales everywhere. So before I finish an analysis or interpretation, I always say to myself, To whom has such a story to be told? Who needs that? And generally it is just perfect for the nation where the story originated, which is why people tell it to each other there with such pleasure. I want now to begin with what I call evil met with on a primitive level. By this I do not mean that the level is sociologically primitive, nor does it imply a primitive nation or particular person, but the situation is primitive in the sense of original man who is still living in nature. For us, this is the past, and it has partly become a sociological problem. For instance, we find Stone Age features nowadays in peasants who live in the mountains or in obscure mountain valleys. So there it is also a sociological and historical problem. But here I mean primitive man in the sense of a man in his original condition. Man still living in nature at a time when certain historically built up sociological and religious superstructures did not yet exist. I will try to show you fairy tales which mirror the basic layer of what was then probably original evil for man. You may say I have not yet defined what evil is. I talk about the problem of evil as if we knew what it was. I prefer to first present to you with some practical material illustrating how it looks on different levels. We can discuss it better if we have as facts in hand the problems of evil in fairy tales or in the ethnological and folklore material of primitive man. I would also like to call your attention to something else. Zoologist Konrad Lorenz has published a book on the so-called evil, the word so-called implying that it is not really evil. It does not intend to imply that in his own opinion it should not be called evil, but the subject matter is represented from a purely zoological standpoint. He discusses the problems of self-defense and aggression and what he calls intraspecific aggression, which means the aggressive tendencies and the patterns of behavior of different animals, fish, and birds, both among each other and toward the other types of animals. Most animal species have their specific enemy types. They don't bother about other animals, but just ignore them. Also, Lorenz speaks of intra-specific enemies, meaning the battles over feeding grounds and territories, which are carried out by strong males of the same specific among each other. For instance, a blackbird would not react toward a mouse on its territory, but will react toward another blackbird, and will carry out such an intraspecific fight, even to the death. Lorenz feels that man has over-differentiated or overdeveloped this intraspecific fighting tendency in that way is an abnormal animal. He says that if we do not want mass suicide of our species, we had better become conscious of this fact. And he then proposes simple animal-level remedies, which, he says, are not supposed to solve the world problem, but are only his contribution toward it. One suggestion is to get to know each other better, because as soon as animals know each other well, their intraspecific aggressions are braked. When one animal is accustomed to the smell of another animal, it can't kill anymore. Lorenz performed such experiments with rats. He took a rat out of its tribe and put it into a hostile rat tribe. When he reintroduced it to its own tribe, it had the smell of the others and was torn into bits instantly. But if the rat was first put into a cage so that the others couldn't tear it to pieces at once, but could sniff it at it for a few days, they then would not kill it, which shows, put into plain words, that if we sniff each other that we should sniff each other a bit more. This is certainly a constructive proposition, but, as Lorenz himself admits, it only comments on a certain instinctual level of the whole problem. I warmly recommend the book, for it illustrates well much of the problem we are now going to discuss, especially in connection with what compromised evil for primitive man and his reactions to it. As far as I know, the phenomenon of evil in a primitive setup is simply the appearance of something demonic or abnormal, a kind of overpowering nature phenomenon, which does not pose any ethical problem, but the purely practical one of which to either overcome or successfully escape it. It becomes a question as to whether one can overpower the phenomenon or whether one simply has to save one's own life. Subjective questioning as to whether one has made a mistake in letting the other thing attack, or as to personal responsibility for the phenomenon, does not exist on this level. I will give you an example of such a story. I generally base my material on the collection Deichmarken der Wutenlauter, published by Diederichs Jena, in which there is a volume for practically every country. It is arbitrarily chosen material, but the themes are repeated so frequently that it gives enough examples of what we want to illustrate. In the Chinese volume, there is a story from the oral peasant tradition. The Horse Mountain Ghost. At the bottom of the Horse Mountain is a village where a peasant lived by selling corn. To do so, he always rode to the next little town. One day, slightly drunk, he returned from the market on his mule, and coming around a bend he saw a monster. Its enormous face was blue, and its eyes, which popped out of its head like a crab's, were bright and shining. Its mouth stretched from one ear to the other, and looked like a bowl of blood, in which was a chaotic mass of very long pointed teeth. It was sitting near the river, and had just bent down to drink. One could hear it lapping up the water quite plainly. The peasant was terribly frightened, but thank God the monster had not yet seen him. So he quickly took a smaller path, which people sometimes used, and galloped away as fast as he could. But when he turned the corner, he heard someone behind calling him out. He looked back and saw his neighbor's son, so he stopped. The man said, "Old Lee is very ill and won't last very long, so his son asked me to go to the market to get a coffin, and I am just on my way back. Can I come with you?" The peasant agreed, and the man asked why he was going this unusual way. The peasant replied, rather uneasily, that he had wanted to go the other way, but had seen a monster which was absolutely awful, so he ran away. The neighbor said, "When I hear you talk like that, I get frightened myself and am afraid to go home alone. How would it be if I were to sit on the mule with you?" The peasant agreed, and the neighbor got up on the mule with him. After a while, the neighbor asked what the monster looked like, but the peasant answered that he felt much too uneasy to say, and that he would explain when he got home. "If you don't want to talk," the other said, "then turn around and look at me and see if I look anything like the monster." The peasant replied that he should not make such silly jokes, for a human being does not look like a devil. But the other man insisted and said, "But look at me." He pulled the peasant's arm, and the latter looked around, and there sat the monster he had seen at the stream, and he got such a fright that he fell unconscious from the mule and remained there. The mule knew the way home, and when people saw it return riderless, they suspected that something bad happened. They split up and hunted for the missing peasant, and found him at the bottom of the cliff, and brought him home. But it was midnight before he recovered consciousness, and could tell them what had happened to him. This is a classical story. I could tell you any number of the same type from Eskimos, from Swiss peasants, and from African and South American countries. It is a completely international story, and is in a Chinese volume just by chance. What seems to us that the story does not seem to have any point. It is just exciting, it makes you feel shivery. If you tell it or read it in the evening before you go to bed, you suddenly don't want to go upstairs, and you look all around and are afraid. You know how those ghost stories make you feel in a terrible and in a wonderful way. It is a gruesome wonder which many people have experienced in childhood. People have a certain pleasure in that. I have often watched the children and noticed that if one keeps them away from such stories, they invent and enjoy them themselves. Some friends of my childhood had a big garden, and every evening the children played the same game. My friend, her brother, and two of her cousins would line up in the dark garden and talk about the yellow dwarf who was sitting on the manure heap at the end of the garden, and one of them had to go quite alone, as far as he dared, in the dark, toward the invented figure of the yellow dwarf. Generally, they would manage 8 or 9 steps, and then would rush back, and the one who got closest to the dwarf won. So you see, it was not only terrible, but also exciting. For instance, people run when there is a really dreadful car accident, and afterward bathe in recounting all the details. They will tell it once or even twice at the table and turn quite white and say they feel so sick they can't even eat anything. That is the primitive peasant in man. They will describe the condition of a body which has been under an avalanche for 20 years, or a corpse which has lain in the water for a week, saying that you could only see the teeth and the dentist had to identify the body, giving all the details. They can never spare you, but bathe in it. Young said that in Africa, whenever something awful happened, everybody would sit around the corpse for hours, palavering about it and feeding on that terrible sight. If we take the monster of the story as a personification of such a phenomenon of evil in nature, then we can say that it is supernatural. It is highly numinous and therefore highly fascinating, which is why one has all this pleasurable excitement about it. And it is frightening. It is terrifying as it is attractive, and it is an absolutely non-personal and non-human phenomenon. It is like an avalanche, or lightning, or a terrible enemy animal. There are things like this: illness and death, and spirits in nature, monsters, ogres which appear to be as real as other destructive phenomena in nature, and you have to deal with them. If there is an avalanche, you either erect an obstruction or run from it. It would be foolish to do anything else. If the river overflows its banks, you either put up a barricade or, if you are too weak to pile up stones against this evil, you retire on a higher level or a mountain. There is no ethical problem. It is simply a question of fighting if one can or running away if one can't. But it is nature and an important factor. It has about it something divine, which is shown in its attractive numinosity and a desire to hear about it. It is also archetypal, for figures such as the horse mountain ghost exist all over the world. That is, the human psyche is structured to produce such fantasies everywhere. Wherever man has lived in nature, there were such horse mountain ghosts around, which, though slightly different, all have the same feature of being unnatural, superhuman, gruesome, and overwhelming. That is how evil looks on this level. This horse mountain ghost is not a human being, but one could call it a nature divinity. Now I will give you the same phenomenon when it appears in or through a human being. This is a South American Indian story from the Waru tribe, and it is in the volume of the South American Indian fairy tales. The Spear Legs. There were two brothers who liked to go hunting in the loneliness of the forest. One day they heard a noise as of a drinking feast, and the elder brother said, "Let's go and see." The younger said that it couldn't be real people. They were much too far away in the woods for such a feast, so they must be ghosts. But the other brother insisted on investigating. So they followed the sound of the voices and found a number of human beings having a big festival, and the brothers joined them. The elder brother in particular drank a lot, but the younger brother rather nervously refused to drink anything, and felt suspicious and had the feeling that they had fallen among the Warakiki, the great rain frogs who had taken on human form. His suspicion proved to be well founded. After a while the brothers went on their way. As night was approaching, they built a roof under a tree to protect themselves, and the elder brother sent the younger to fetch wood, and they put up hammocks and made a fire. And the elder brother always made the younger put more and more wood on the fire and make it bigger and bigger. But the younger brother suddenly noticed a strange smell of burning flesh, and he noticed that his brother's legs were hanging out of the hammock over the fire, and he called out to him to look out. But the other brother only said, "Aka! Aka!" which is an expression of astonishment in the Waru language, but it is also very much like the rain frog's croak. The elder brother pulled his legs in, but then forgot again and let them hang over, and the younger brother thought that was a very bad sign. After a while, the elder brother himself noticed that his legs were burnt completely away, right up to the knees, and it had become like charcoal. So he took a knife and cut away the flesh and the feet and made points at the bottom of the bones of the legs, making them into spears. When he lay in his hammock, he tried to catch squirrels and birds which came along. After a while, he became very proficient in the sport. Naturally, he had to stay in his hammock all the time, and the younger brother had to get his food and serve him. But the elder brother became more and more tyrannical, and finally would not even let the younger brother leave the hut for any length of time, so that the latter felt he must get help, and he ran away. When the elder brother noticed that the younger no longer came when he called, he jumped out of the hammock and ran after him, and found that he could run more quickly on his spear legs than on his feet. By his mistake, he followed the footprints of deer, thinking they were those of his brother, and when he came up to the deer, he jumped on it and speared it to the ground. He then said to the deer, "I am sorry, brother, that I have killed you, but it is your own fault. You shouldn't have run away from me." Then he turned the deer over and saw the animal's black mouth and thought that was funny. Had he got it from eating fruit? Then he noticed the 4 legs and thought that was very funny, and then he began to count the fingers. This took him a long time, but he finally discovered that it couldn't possibly be his brother that he had killed, but that he had killed a deer. So he went back to his hut and lay on his hammock. In the meantime, the younger brother had gone home and said that something had happened to his elder brother, that he couldn't be his friend any longer, that he must be killed. So he led the villagers back into the wood, where they surrounded the hut in which the elder brother was lying. They were afraid to attack because of the spear legs, but tried to lure him out of the hammock into the open. First they sent a bird to entice him, but the elder brother was so quick with his spear legs that he killed it. Finally, they got Hurrah, the little squirrel, the quickest animal they knew, to lure him out. The squirrel would always run past him, and he tried to spear it, but at last he followed Hurrah out of his hut, and the people made a circle around him and killed him. In a way, there is not much difference between the two stories, because again you see that evil is brought about by a ghost. Obviously, the big rain frog ghosts are responsible for the elder brother's transformation and illness, so that it is they, behind the scenes, who are the real problem of evil. Though there is no direct fight with the rain frog ghosts, the problem is that they alter the human being in the form of possession, so that the man is no longer human but himself behaves exactly like a demon. This is to illustrate the problem of the phenomenon of possession, which ethnologists considered the greatest problem in primitive society. We psychologists believe that it is so in every society. Possession means being assimilated by some numinous archetypal image, and this story shows wonderfully the slow, horrible dehumanization of the elder brother, beginning when he joins the drinking party and has no instinctual warning. The other brother has something which tells him to look out, but the elder brother says not to mind, that they must have a good time. That is a pardonable mistake, but from then on the elder brother is possessed. The next thing, which is still relatively harmless, is when he puts too much wood on the fire, but that shows a lack of judgment. In primitive society, where collecting wood and food means hard work, nobody uses too much wood. In a peasant society, it is a great sin before the Lord to throw away bread, and, in a similar way, it is an abnormality if you throw too much wood on the fire. Where the hardships of life are great, one learns to do everything to save effort and respect every people's effort as much as possible. All rules are kept meticulously, and to break such rules is very bad. For instance, where I go on holiday, there is an unwritten rule which I would never dare go against. If you find a nice block of wood lying around, you may take it, but if you have already as much as you can carry, then you put it upright against a tree, and nobody may ever touch it. If you have taken possession of the wood by that sign, it would be the greatest sin to touch it. Much worse than going inside somebody's house to take wood. That is how the primitive feels. And if you know how hard it is to carry wood home, then you know why. If the next day the wood is gone, you get into an absolutely murderous rage. It is absolutely paramount for living together in human society that such rules are kept, and they are kept, strangely enough, even by the evildoers of the country around. But in our story, the elder brother throws too much wood on the fire, and that is a terrible thing to do, if you know the setup of the situation. Then, when he burns his legs, he says, "Aka!" and goes on doing it. He has lost the instinct of self-preservation, and now there is a very bad change in his personality. From then on, he is a demon and behaves exactly like the Horse Mountain demon. And what is interesting is that by falling into evil, he gets supernatural power, superhuman gifts and qualities. Imagine being able to lie in a hammock and spear squirrels and birds with your legs. Analyzed psychologically, this is exactly what happens if a human being identifies with an archetypal figure. He gets a life energy and even certain parapsychological gifts, clairvoyance and so on, connected with the archetype. Psychotic borderline cases even often have parapsychological gifts, knowing through the unconscious things which they couldn't otherwise know. As soon as you fall into an archetype, or identify with the problems of the unconscious, you get those supernatural gifts. And that is one reason why people do not like to be exorcised or rehumanized again. The loss of those gifts accounts for one of the resistances against therapy. In this primitive setup, there seems to be no idea of therapy, or the exorcism of this poor hunter by a ritual. His people simply say he has become a devil and has to be removed. Again, there is no ethical problem. The phenomenon is treated like an avalanche, or a wild beast, or an earthquake. You do something against it if you can, and run away from it if you can. The same treatment is accorded to the evil ghost in the Chinese story as to the man possessed by the evil ghost. It is a practical problem, and nothing else. I think that is something very important to know, because naturally one has such a basic primitive reaction in oneself, too. We have not got away from it. It is still one of the basic realities. In the volume of the South American Indian tales, there is a demon story which is another example of this gruesome problem. It is not what you would describe as possession, but as alteration of a human being. The Rolling Skull. A group of hunters camped in the forest and collected a quantity of meat. Many apes were on the spit near the fire, and the skins of the apes that had been killed lay all around the camp. The hunters had gone off hunting, leaving only one boy in the camp to overlook the cooking of the meat. Suddenly there appeared a man in the camp. With a grim face he inspected all the booty and counted the hammocks, and then left. When the hunters returned to the camp in the evening, the boy told them of his strange visitor, but nobody took any notice. But when the men had all gone to bed, he repeated the story to his father, who got upset, and he and the boy took their hammocks into the darkness and put them up in another place away from the camp. Before long they heard owls and tigers and other nocturnal animals, and the groans of human beings and the breaking of bones. "On," the man said to his son. "This is Kurapira, the spirit of the woods, who, with his followers, kills the hunters." In the morning they returned to the camp and found empty blood-stained hammocks and the remains of broken human bones. Among these lay the head of one of the hunters. When the man and the boy turned to leave, the head cried out, "Take me with you, brother." The man looked astonished, and the skull repeated, "Take me home, brother." Then the man sent the boy ahead on the way back to the village, and he himself took a rope and tied it to the skull and dragged it behind him. After a while it began to seem uncanny, and he left it behind. But the skull ran after him, like a gourd, crying, "Brother, brother, wait a bit, take me with you." So the man had to go slowly, so that the skull could roll along behind him, and he always pondered as to why to get rid of his uncanny companion. He asked it to wait a minute, saying he had to go into the forest. Then he did not return to the skull, but rejoined the path a good bit further on. There he made a trench, where he covered with small twigs so as to trap the skull. He hid himself to watch. Meanwhile, the skull kept calling out, "Brother, haven't you finished yet?" And the man's excrements replied, "Not yet, brother, not yet." But the skull said, "What? In my time, when I was a man, excrement couldn't talk." So he rolled along on the path and soon fell into the trap. The man then came out and covered the place over and stamped it down hard and then went on to his village. But when night fell, cries came from the wood, getting nearer and nearer to the village. "That's the skull which has got out of the trap," the man said to the other villagers. Meanwhile, the skull had acquired wings and claws like a big falcon. It flew toward the village and threw itself on the first man who came across his path and ate him up. But the next evening a medicine man hid on a path which led out of the wood and waited for the monster with his bow and arrow. When darkness fell it came, uttering cries, and it settled itself on a tree at the edge of the forest. It now looked like an enormous falcon. Then the medicine man shot it between the eyes with his arrow, and the monster fell to the ground, dead. There is a parallel story about such an uncanny skull in which the medicine man throws it into the sky, where it turns into the moon, and from then on it is the moonlight in the night. This type of uncanny and evil phenomenon, seen from a primitive standpoint, is a phenomenon which is still to be found in Greek and Egyptian civilizations, and which survived in the magical practices of antiquity. It still exists nowadays in our folklore, concerns people who have committed suicide, who have been killed, or died before their time. Such people turn hostile after death and turn into evil demons. The primitive explanation for this is what they feel frustrated, for there is a certain amount of life energy in them which has not been exhausted, but has now naturally blocked before the proper time. The clock's spring has broken instead of running down, and that unexhausted life energy turns hostile. The dead person is jealous of the living and has not time to detach naturally from the living, and therefore now has a destructive and dangerous effect in the world of the living. Therefore, even people who during their lifetime were really good people and not possessed by evil can, out of resentment at having been robbed of life, turn into such a thing if they are killed before their time. That is why late antique invocations of black magic always begin, "O, you gods of the netherworld, Hades, Proserpina, you, the nameless, enormous army of those who killed themselves, or who were murdered, or died before their time." That is the classical late Greek invocation to be found in most of the magical papery of antiquity. This belief existed not only in late antiquity, but all over the world. Normal life energy, which has not been used up, turns a human being into an evil ghost, and in our story shows the slow transformation. What was only a human skull becomes a real ghost-like falcon, for it grows wings, becomes more and more numinous and supernatural. First there is an unhappy hunter, resentful that he has been killed, but then he himself becomes like one of the Kurapira of mob owls and tigers and ghost animals. Now we have to try to look at this problem from a psychological standpoint. I have too often seen the bad effects of sudden deaths of my own relatives and those of my Nalzans not to know that there might be, besides the problem of projection, a very objective basis for these beliefs. The problem really needs more explanation. It often happens that people who have lost a close relative have, after some days, a car accident. One might use the rationalistic explanation that it is because one is tired and unhappy after the funeral, or one might say that the dead person is pulling one into the grave. No one can say which is the true explanation, but psychologically there is the phenomenon of a death pull. Where it comes from, we cannot say, but it is there, and after the death of a close relative, it is a phenomenon which can clearly be seen. Rationally, it might be said that the amount of psychic libido which is invested in the relationship goes back into us and has no other outlet. This is especially the case if you lose someone with whom you have lived closely, for an enormous amount of psychic energy went into the adaptation and relationship with that person, and suddenly that is all cut off. So the energy now flows back on you, but it has no use, and any unparked energy is liable to have a dangerous effect. These forces make you unconscious. They dissociate the personality until new objects of adaptation and canalization are found, and things go better. That is, so I am absolutely convinced. One can really see how it works, and it can be seen in detail. If you lost somebody with whom you lived closely, when you wake in the morning and have forgotten that the person is dead, you want to say, "Oh, Hulu, good morning," but the person is no longer there. Or you have a pleasant experience and you want to tell it to that someone, but you can't. To whom can you tell it now? You always fall into the same terrible hole. Everybody who has lost someone they have loved has had the terrible experience of wanting to move toward the other person, and then they fall into the black hole in the ground. And if that happens to someone who is not very conscious and does not realize what is happening, if the personality is not strong, that person can be dissociated, or the energy flows into inappropriate objects. In primitive society, and I have seen it in our country, it may then take the form of a black rage, and you find a scapegoat. It gives birth to the idea that the man has not died naturally, that there has been black magic, and someone must now be killed to satisfy this feeling of revenge. In our society, it can be an accusation against the doctor, or there can be terrible quarrels of the distribution of the inheritance, not because people are really so greedy, wanting to get this or that carpet, or something from their departed father, but because they have to abreact this excess of libido which they do not know where to place. So they have to find that doctor or the nurse that has been the devil itself, and there are always these post-mortem devilries going around. A certain amount can certainly be explained in this way. In an Alzan's dream material, however, this is often formulated differently, saying that it is really the dead person who is creating mischief. So, take it or leave it. You can choose the hypothesis.